Oh man, right now, Sway's Universe, we got a good friend, Rich Nice, is with me. Rich Nice, how it goes?
Oh man, great to be here. Fantastic to be here.
All right, and I'm honored to have with me the creative director at Mass Appeal, great friend of mine. Loved all the work he's done over the years. Beat Down Newspaper was one of the things he founded back in the early 90s, maybe I don't know, 91, 92.
Right.
Went on to do Eagle
92,
Tripping
92.
magazine. He established done a lot of documentaries. To me, he's one of the most important person in terms of documenting our history, especially in music and hip hop culture, in our society. We got the one and only Sacha Jenkins with us. Sacha, welcome, Sacha. How you doing, brother?
I'm well. Thanks for having me. Always appreciate the platform.
Absolutely. Today we come together to talk about Rick James, Bitchin, the sound and fury of Rick James. And this is something that's available on Showtime. It's an incredible body of work that you had a chance to direct. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before we get into Rick, man, I want to say congratulations on Mass Appeal too. Hey, dude, King Disease 2, man. That was pretty damn dope, man. How excited are y'all around the office?
I mean, I'm not really involved with the music stuff, but the office is on fire. And, Nas is a rare artist that can still remain contemporary and have a legacy. You got the Rolling Stones, you got groups in other genres of music who can keep it going and keep it popping. But Nas, first of all, much like you gentlemen, keeping it tight, looking like your workout regimen is good. I don't know if it's good genes or Nas's workout regimen, but the guy also doesn't age much, if at all. So guy stays contemporary, works with the right people, has got relevant things to say, and he's still here, and it's a great boost to Mass Appeal for sure.
Absolutely. What about you? I mean, you've been able to establish a long and prosperous and fruitful career. What is it about your approach you think has kept you here this long?
Curiosity and the desire to tell our stories the right way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I'm special. I just think that I have an opportunity. And if there are more people who look like us who have opportunity to tell these stories, more work will come out that is representative of who we are and how we feel. So I feel very lucky to have the platforms that I've had over the last few years to tell our stories, and I'm very passionate about it.
Here's a question. I watched the documentary Bitchin, the Sound and Fury of Rick James. What an amazing piece of work. I learned about Rick James, some things I didn't know. And then it was refreshing to kind of go back and remember the things that I did know. And I always saw Rick as just an extremely talented and fiery and explosive stage performer and musician. But I didn't know the layers to who he is, and I'm curious to, when you did this documentary, was there anything that you found out about him that you didn't know that surprised you? For example, Rick was an activist in many ways, and I really didn't know that side of him. I only knew his music, and his plight of, stepping up to MTV because they weren't playing black music at the time, even though it didn't benefit him, it benefited people like Michael Jackson. It was kind of people like him that triggered that. What is it that you found out about him that might have surprised you?
Well, people will be surprised to know that he didn't really get on as a musician and really make it until he was in his 30s. I mean, if you're a rapper now, maybe you start out at 17. If you're not on by like 24, it's like you got to figure out what your next move is. And the fact that he had stuck around for so long and had the success that he had. And also, when you look at all the groups leading up to his final breakthrough hit, You and I, you can hear all the evolution and the learning is in that song. All the groups that he played in before, being a songwriter in Motown, being in these folk rock bands, being in funky bands, all these things added up to what he created, which was extremely unique. So perseverance, he just stuck with it. And that's a trait that a lot of people don't really possess, especially now. We have such short attention spans. You could be hot for 10 minutes on the internet and 2 weeks later, no one remembers your record. He refused to be a bargain bin artist. Mm-hmm. And he had a couple of records in the bargain bin that sound pretty dope, if you ask me. But so many people wind up in that void. He refused to go down that void. And so here he is.
You talk about some of the folk bands he played in. He had a stint in Canada
Yep.
right? And played with the likes of Bob Dylan and others, correct?
Not Bob Dylan, Neil Young.
Okay, Neil Young. He played with the.
Yeah, the band that backed Bob Dylan, who would go on to be called The Band, he played with some of those guys.
He played with some of those guys. How did he get to Canada?
He was going AWOL from the military because he signed up from the Navy. He signed up and he had to go to like a meeting once a month and he just stopped going. And then he realized they were looking for him. So he said, yo, I'm going to skate to Canada like a lot of people did. The minute he gets off the bus, these white guys surround him and call him the N-word. Then all of a sudden, these other white guys come to his defense and it winds up being the band, the guys who played with Bob Dylan. And then all of a sudden he's chilling with Joni Mitchell and in a band with Neil Young and doing all these things. And then eventually he has a manager, has a falling out with the manager snitches on him. He gets violated, goes to the military brig, gets out, goes back to Canada. Where's everybody at? Everybody went to California and got record deals. So Neil Young wound up in Buffalo, Springfield, all these things, all these people he knew were on. But he went out there trying to get on and it didn't really work. So what did he do? He went to Colombia and picked up some cocaine. He went to India and picked up heroin. He did all of these things while simultaneously spending his money and his mind and his creativity on creating new sounds and new bands. And it wasn't until, again, he was in his 30s that the iteration of the fully realized vision of what he had in his head and in his heart finally came to be after all those trials and tribulations.
After all those trials and tribulations, man, nowadays, when you think of Buffalo, you think of Griselda.
Well, that's why I had Conway in the film.
Yeah, yeah. And Conway riding around the city and talking about the legend of Rick James. What Buffalo, Rick James is to Buffalo what Prince is to Minneapolis, right?
Totally. But I think people know a little bit more about Minneapolis and absolutely nothing about Buffalo. So, in order to understand Rick James or Conway, you got to unpack the city that they're from. And pretty much, people confirm that Buffalo was racist then. And Conway, in the way that he describes it, in turn, he ends his statement by saying, I'm from this part of town and I pretty much stay where I belong. He said, I stay where I belong. What the fuck does that mean? It means that he's obviously Conway, he's a world traveler and does his thing, but in his hometown, he feels most comfortable where he quote unquote belongs. What the fuck is that? Well, it just gives you a window into what Buffalo might be like. And so the things that Rick James talked about on the Street Songs album is what Conway was saying. We can relate to what he's saying. It's how we grew up. So basically we're saying shit has not changed in Buffalo for Black folks.
When I was a young boy, growing up in the ghetto, hanging on the corner.
Buffalo was tough. I mean, I went to Syracuse, and I remember sometimes you get on the wrong bus or your bus has to connect in Buffalo, you'd always get that conversation like, "Hey man, watch yourself, because Buffalo ain't an easy town. Don't let them mountains fool you. You can get hurt up there."
Right. So there are projects in Buffalo. We shot where his projects are abandoned, but any opportunity I get to fly a drone over the projects, whether it's in Buffalo or in Queens, I'm doing it. So he was a world traveler, and he was culturally very literate in the way that I referenced Pharrell. Pharrell was a guy who liked skateboarding and rock music and all these things at a time when it was like, if you were a Black dude, it's weird if you like all that stuff. Rick James was that guy who put all of that culture together early, was able to be himself. He didn't have to change his identity. He didn't have to code switch to fit in because they wanted the essence. In Canada, they were happy to have a Black musician who was authentic on their team because they were all inspired and influenced by Black musicians. So here he is like, oh shit, I'm around white people who are cool and I don't have to change who I am, and they like me and they respect me as an artist. That must have been an incredible feeling considering the times he was living in. Now, I'm not saying that Canada doesn't have racism and there aren't racist people, but apparently it was a bit different from America. And so he felt a bit of freedom. And I feel like most Black artists, the closest they get to freedom in this country is through expression. Now, when Rick James is on stage and he's being all that he can be, that's the closest he ever comes to the feeling of freedom. And that's what Rick James has in common with Louis Armstrong, that he has in common with James Brown, that he has in common with Nas. And I've come to believe, because I'm actually doing a Louis Armstrong film right now, there are no genres.
Mm-hmm. Speak to that.
There's just Black suffering and oppression and our reaction to that through art, our way of coping with that through art. Louis Armstrong caught a gun charge at 14. Okay? He goes to reform school. He learns about music in reform school. You know, James Brown caught charges. He went to reform school and learned, you know, that's where he really honed his musicianship. Mm-hmm. So it's like, outside of the so-called genre, it's the same story. Louis Armstrong's from the ghetto. Louis Armstrong got out of the ghetto by way of his music. People were captivated by his expression and the authenticity of what it was he was transmitting. And he had this joy and this energy. It's like, yeah, he's smiling all the time, but it's because he's trying to get away from the oppression. He's trying to find a way out. And that's all we continue to do with all of this music. And Rick James, while he didn't like hip hop, he told you like, yo, but when that Hammer money came in, you know, it was good. And I saw a tweet from Chuck D, who said that he really loved the film and that Rick James and the Stone City Band gave PE advice real early and was super supportive of them. So I think Rick was sophisticated enough to see himself in hip hop. He might not have always liked all of it, and I'm there too. I don't like all of it either. Mm-hmm. But I think he was sophisticated enough to see himself and see other generations of people like him in it. And he had no choice but to embrace it at some point.
So we got Sacha Jenkins talking with us. Rich Knights, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, you know, I want to congratulate you on this film. My one and only disappointment was that Slick Rick James wasn't alive to sit with you and really, you know, complete the film. It felt though as moments that he was alive. Were you aware of that as you were making this film? Because obviously he's passed away, but in that process, it felt like he was talking directly to me in parts of this film.
Well, he was. I mean, we used his voice. We were able to, interestingly enough, behind the music, a lot of it was outtakes from behind the music that we were able to repurpose. But his daughter, Ty, was very, you know, there's a lot of not so pretty things in the film. And I told her early on, like, yo, there has to be balance. Otherwise, it's just, I'm going to look crazy doing a full-time celebration of Rick James without getting into cancel
drug use, the controversy, the jail stint, all of these different things, right?
Right. And so when she saw it, she was just like, I feel like my father would have really approved of this. I feel like you were fair. And my father knew he had issues, and he talks about it in the film. You know, he talks about hitting this woman, like, yeah, I put hands on the woman, but after the woman, during a crack binge, kicked his pregnant wife, whatever. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, he did his, the other argument is he did his time. You know, he committed the crimes, he did the time. So I tried to be balanced, but in terms of feeling him in the film, as weird as it might sound, I knew Tina Marie, and I was in the process of doing a project with Tina Marie before she died. And I had a decent relationship with her. I didn't know her super well, but she was really cool. And it sounds crazy, but I believe, because I was up to do this film like 4 years ago, and then it went away mysteriously. Like, people stopped calling me, whatever, and it came back around. Like, I believe, call Miss Cleo or whoever you want to call, I believe in my heart that Tina Marie put in the word to Rick James for me to do this. There's no other explanation for it. Mm-hmm. And I think that warmth of his voice is in there. And then his homeboys, you know, like, they talk shit about him, but they love him at the same time. They're mad that he died. He says, you know, you couldn't let that white bitch go. You couldn't let that cocaine go. They're mad at him, but they love him at the same time. They claim they didn't get paid, but they still love him and appreciate the opportunity. And I think we're all nuanced. When we all go, there are things that people are going to love about us and say things that they didn't love about us. But I think the love and respect is there, and the proof is in his artistry. It's still being sampled. People know the music if you don't know him. And, you know, people know I'm Rick James bitch most recently, but now they'll have a picture, a snapshot of where all that came from.
And that's the irony, because there's so many layers to him, and some of the things that make him most popular were accompanied by other artists. You know, when you look at MC Hammer sampling Super Freak and winning a Grammy for Can't Touch This. Meanwhile, you know, Rick James hadn't won a Grammy yet. He had only been nominated for 2, I believe, up until that point. But Best Male Vocal for Street Songs, and then also Super Freak. Why do you think that is? That was 10 years later when Hammer sampled that song.
Why do I think
why do you think he never had a Grammy prior to that?
I mean, you know, I can do a whole dissertation on the Grammys, but for the reasons why it took a long time for hip hop to get recognized, I think Rick James, although he wasn't hip hop, he was hip hop. Mm-hmm. He was a threat. He talked shit. He wasn't He wasn't just gonna comply, and that is dangerous. I mean, a black man who has a platform, who is not afraid to say, I don't care, this is what I have to say, and it's important to people like me and people who look like me, is a threat. Is a threat. He's not just cashing checks. He's a threat. And at the same time, you know, he's fighting MTV. Did I believe in my heart that he felt that he was doing the right thing? Yes. Did I believe in my heart that he felt it was racist and that other artists could benefit from it? Yes. But simultaneously, he was thinking about himself. He wanted to shine. He wanted to have the success. So it's a complicated balance, but a real honest look at someone who is, like all of us, very nuanced and not always on script.
Mm-hmm. When I think of Rick, and I'll let you jump in, Rich, you might even want to chime into this, and this is just my personal view. I always looked at Lenny Kravitz, right? And when I would look at Lenny Kravitz, I would go, man, I see Prince in him.
Right.
And when I would look at Prince, I would say, man, I see Rick James in him. Right. And then we take it back to Jimi Hendrix. You know, I'm curious too, because, you know, Rick came in and he was unapologetic. He had his own thing, kind of like Prince did, you know, and he wasn't always welcomed. He wasn't always open arm welcomed. You know, people like George Clinton or folks who felt like he was in the same realm saw him as competition. Like, who is this dude and what is he doing? What was those relationships like? What did you find out about that? How was it just competitive with George Clinton or Prince, or what were those relationships like? Is that just what we tend to see in the music business?
Well, you know, I think that with Prince, it was a bit of competition. I mean, Rick sincerely liked Prince and thought he was talented and actually saw a kinship. He's like, all right, here's his brother who can, you know, I don't know if you saw that award show where Prince comes out and plays guitar and smokes everybody and everyone doesn't know what to do. Like, you know, Prince likes lots of things, including rock and roll. So like, you know, he sees himself in this kid, right? He's older than him. But at the same time, when you're just getting on at 30 something, there's some kid that's 10 years younger than you or whatever, coming up, doing his thing, and then like taking some of your routines, you're going to get mad. That's just very natural. It's not strange, but Rick himself in the end says, look, at the end of the day, I respect the guy. He's great. I didn't really have beef. And I think Rick was the one, at least, you know, it was said in the film that Bootsy said that Rick was the one saying shit like, I'm selling more records than y'all, or whatever. You know, it's like, I think people forget that, or we take for granted that Black people, that humor and irony and sarcasm and all these things are just built into our art, right? So it's always jokes, because again, it's always a way to get away from feeling down or oppression. It's like, you gotta laugh through the tears and shit, right? So Rick James is snapping the whole time, but he has respect for everybody. And I think the people who knew, because George Clinton and those guys were on some psychedelic hippie shit. So was Rick James. I mean, Rick James almost went to the Manson murders.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, he's like the Forrest Gump of like Black artists, you know, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He was there. So I think they all respected him and he respected them. They knew his pedigree. He knew their pedigree. They ran in similar circles. But you know, at the end of the day, brothers are trying to get checks too, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I always, as a kid, was baffled about, which the documentary kind of touched on, and I really appreciated that. I mean, I was able to figure it out as an adult, but he was very androgynous in this presentation, you know,
Right.
and you know, with the tights, you know, in the high boots, in the braids in his hair, and people didn't understand where the braids came from. They didn't know if he was trying to emulate a woman, or you know, they just didn't have any idea. You were able to break that down in this documentary really well, and it spoke to his consciousness, his identity, you know, and what was important to him, why he wore his hair like that. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, he met a woman from the Maasai tribe in Africa on a flight, and admired her hair and started asking her questions. And she had a book or had some photography and showed him more. And he asked her, "Can you do my hair like that?" And she said, "Yeah." And so, like you said, this consciousness that he's always had, again, he never had to compromise his identity. He never had to compromise his blackness. And he referenced so much great black art in his own art, down to hair from Africa. So he was a very forward-thinking guy, but also a very tormented and tortured and conflicted guy. And I wanted people to understand, you know, early on in the film, you learn he was sexually abused, you learn he was physically abused. And if you put sexual abuse next to physical abuse, and you hop in a time machine and you look at the shit that he got into, maybe what happened to him as a kid maybe had an effect on who he became as a man. But you try to look at the complete picture of, in my opinion, it's all stemming from journalism. Like, I still believe in journalism, and a lot of people don't believe in journalism anymore, but I think having balance is important. And so you got to look at the good and the bad, and there's a lot of bad along with a lot of good.
I mean, he was one of the first people I really remember seeing interview clips of admitting that, hey man, I like drugs.
Right.
That was okay. Wow, that's something people didn't vocalize, right?
Right.
Do we know when he first experimented?
I think he experimented at a very young age, but you look at the song he wrote, Mary Jane, right? Weed was real taboo. Now weed is essentially legal, and people understand the medicinal uses for it and how it can actually be helpful. He was advocating for it and like dodging getting in a lot of trouble for doing that, you know, smoking weed on stage and like running off stage and leaving town. I mean, that happened a few times. It didn't make the film, but you know, now weed is commonplace. But you know, before Cypress Hill, and much respect to Cypress, who are big advocates and continue to be advocates, Rick James was doing that. You know, Ice Cube talks about how Mr. Policeman was a precursor to Fuck the Police. How that was an influence on him. Who knew that?
Yeah.
You know, so I think it's the same story, whether it's Louis Armstrong or Rick James or RZA. You know, Rick James's mom ran numbers, so did RZA's mom. You know, it's the same story over and over again, unfolding in different genres of music, but it's all reflective of how we are who we are in America and how America treats us.
Rich, did you ever get to meet Rick?
Yeah, actually, I did meet Rick. I met Rick twice. I met Rick in New York, and I met him in California. And oddly enough, the California Rick James was very different than the New York Rick James, in my experience. The New York Rick James the music conversation was very musically driven, talking about music. The California Rick James, who are actually, don't ask me how I was hanging out with Charles Barkley, but I'm hanging out with Charles Barkley. This is like BET days, BET from Managing Free. And Rick James' whole conversation was just women and having fun. He did not want to talk about music. It was just all women and fun. He actually posted up next to the women's bathroom, and that's where he was taking meetings, like in front of the woman's bathroom. And it's like, come on, Chuck. Come on, Nice. Come on, Chuck. Come on, Nice. And I'm looking at both of them like, y'all gotta be crazy. That's the woman's bathroom. Like, literally posted in front of it, leaning on the wall, like having interviews. I was like, this is crazy. I managed the host of 106 in Park. I can't do this. Like, y'all are crazy. So right. Bananas. I mean, obviously, it's difficult to capture the whole life of a person like Rick James in a 2-hour film. Was there anything that you didn't put in the film that you wish you did? And was anything you feel like you could have kind of left out at the end and did something else?
No, I think considering all the archival and people we interviewed, I felt like we achieved a good balance. I mean, his brother is claiming to be working on like a 10-part miniseries or something. So obviously his brother knew him well and knows things that I certainly will never know. So maybe there will be something else that comes out. I know his daughter is also working on something. The estate is officially working on something. So there's probably a scripted film. So, just like with the Wu-Tang series I did, it was like the precursor to the Hulu series, which is a
Mm-hmm.
scripted thing. RZA said that my Wu-Tang series was the Bible, and his series is the Ten Commandments, as in the film, as in liberties are taken and you have more creative license. Right. And I think now that there's more people, a new generation of people who might get turned on to Rick James through this film, they're already in the process of doing something on the narrative side. So there'll be other things that didn't make the cut in my film that will certainly come out in the narrative film.
You talked about in the film his stint in Folsom and how we spoke earlier on the incident that led him there. Assaulting a woman. What did Folsom and I hear you talk about Louis Armstrong and we could liken that to Tupac. We could liken it to a whole lot of different folks. What was it about Folsom that changed him? What did Folsom being behind bars do for him?
Well, I think that was Folsom's a real prison, but simultaneously he had a lot of love there. And I think that he had lots of conversations with people who said, man, how did you wind up here, Rick? You're so great. You're such an influence and inspiration. And a broad range of inmates came up to him, even white, all kind, prison is broken down by race. Everybody came to him saying how much they respected him. And I think that he was away from drugs because, as his wife says, he never went more than 3 months without doing drugs.
Yeah.
He was clear-minded, and it gave him the opportunity to supposedly write 400 songs. I don't know where all that output is or how many of them were actually recorded, but it seems like he got some peace of mind there and some focus that was really hard for him to achieve in the real world. So while Folsom Prison is a very tough, hard prison, for Rick, it gave him focus that he was severely lacking in his personal life.
Mm-hmm. He eventually met his children that he hadn't met. Like, was it Ty who didn't meet him till she was 13?
Neither of them. Ty's the older sister, so she's older than her brother by 2 or 3 years. So neither of them, Rick James's son is in school in LA. He's living in the hood telling kids, Rick James is my dad. Some kid overhears him. And it turns out the kid's father works security for Rick James. So the kid tells his father tells Rick James, he says, it might actually be my kid. He hires a private investigator and finds them and then flies them out to Buffalo for the first time. And the funny thing is, when they walked off the plane, there were 2 other black girl and boy who walked out, and he ran up to them and hugged them, and it wasn't his kid. So that's
great. I mean, that's not great, but wow, that's kind of crazy. It's I have a daughter. I couldn't even imagine, but Ty in this documentary in the beginning definitely drives it home, and she has a immense love for her dad. How does she feel like her relationship with him? Did his absence, how does she feel like it affected her life? And it didn't seem like she hesitated from really embracing him.
She talks in the film about how he threw something at her that she had to get stitches and she didn't talk to him for 6 months. But I think she writes it off as, when he's on drugs, he's someone else. That's not my dad. That's a demon. He's possessed by something else. And what he does and says is not true to who he really is. And so I think she reconciles it in that way. She understands that he had a disease. His ex-wife, Tanya, says that he did so much drugs that he needed cocaine to have some sense of pleasure, because he'd done so many drugs that, the stuff that you need, the chemicals in your brain were gone from abusing so many drugs. So, she looks at him as someone who had a disease and succumbed to the disease, unfortunately. I mean, he had a whole bunch of drugs in his system when they did the autopsy. And you know, she's very focused on his legacy and pushing that forward. And you know, her dad did well, so she's doing okay. And there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, you know, there's licenses and requests, and it's seemingly a full-time job. So she does the best she can to sort of maintain his legacy. And you know, again, when we embarked on the film, I said, you've got to let me tell the whole story. Otherwise, it's going to hurt what you're doing anyway. It's going to hurt the credibility of your brand, but also it's just not an honest portrait of who he was. And at a time like this with Me Too and R. Kelly and all these other things, you know, R. Kelly is a contemporary person with issues. Rick James is from a different time, and he, you know, he certainly wasn't the only one. I'm not justifying what he did, but like, if you went back in the time machine, I mean, Elvis's wife was underage. Jerry Lee Lewis married his cousin. You know what I'm saying? There's a lot of wild stuff. So you got to look at him as a man of his time who was flawed, who did his time. People are still going to feel the way they feel, but you can't deny his genius. You can't deny his influence. And that's the story I was trying to tell.
Sacha Jenkins, the director of Bitchin, The Sound and Fury of Rick James. I'm Rick James, bitch.
And Too Short too. You're Rick James and Too Short.
Yeah, man. James and Too Short, man. The Dave Chappelle, I find it fascinating how we uplift each other. You know what I mean? We find each other and we find ways to support each other in some of the strangest circumstances. And Dave Chappelle and Donnell Rawlins and with the I'm Rick James, bitch, you know, saying, and Charlie Murphy really kind of resurrected his visibility to a whole new demographic, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, in some ways it was a mixed bag. Some people who knew him say that at a certain point it started to drive him nuts. Other people say he lived it up and loved it. Either way, that's what makes him so contemporary. If that Rick James bitch moment would have happened in 2021, it would have broken the internet. You know what I'm saying? So Rick recognized that in order to be contemporary in these contemporary times, people have to latch onto your personality. You can be the most prolific musician ever. You can play the guitar better than Prince. Who gives a shit? Like, who are you? What are you about? Are you funny? Are you serious? Are you political? Do you stand for anything? And Rick James was all of those things. So the Chappelle situation propelled his situation and got him back in the public eye. And I think he was appreciative of that.
Okay. A couple things I want to ask you, man. I sat and did this isn't Rick James related. This is Sacha Jenkins related. And I sat and did a conversation about hip hop for a series called Hip Hop 50. You heard of this one, right?
I'm familiar with it.
You're familiar with it. And it's celebrating, it's the 50th anniversary of hip hop as a culture.
Yes.
And what is your role in that? You're directing and producing this, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are films and television shows and podcasts and books and all these things that Mass Appeal is doing in advance and leading up to the 50th anniversary of hip hop, which is August 11th, 2023. So, you know, it's you know, Mass Appeal was very forward thinking in knowing that this is an important milestone and how can we celebrate it? How can we wrap our arms around all of the tentacles of hip hop and the influence of hip hop? Because I mean, I love rock and roll and all that, but nobody, you know, it's like no one cares about Bon Jovi at this point. You know, hip hop is the most relevant, most sought after voice. And it's not just music, as you know, it's culture, it's identity, it's language, it's food, it's jewelry, it's a way to live, and it's unescapable. So we're just shining a light on the many facets of hip hop leading up to its anniversary and celebrating it along the way and being critical of it as well.
Rich, you want to add any final questions?
Yeah. What's the one takeaway you want people to have from the film outside of the entertainment part? If there was one thing you wanted people to get from this Rick James film?
That people are flawed and brilliant at the same time. People are weak and strong, weak in some regards and strong in other regards. And that's how we survive and that's how we perish. It's the choices we make that dictate where we wind up going. Sometimes it's luck and being at the right place at the right time. But if you look at someone like Rick James, he was in the right place at the right time many times, but he just didn't give up on himself. He didn't give up on his dream. Well into his 30s, he didn't give up. And I think regardless of how you feel about him, you can't take away his determination. And I think there are lessons to be learned in his determination and his inspiration and his determination that I think we all can benefit from. And the incredible thing about music is it's such a legacy work of art. He's still alive in many regards. We had some demos and we had some like inside tracks. One of the tracks you can hear in the film where you hear Rick giving direction to his musicians. Mm-hmm. And he's saying, all right, fuck it. Your fingers are wearing out. You're getting tired. Let's just stop. And he laughs. It's like just this opportunity to get to know someone on that level that I had with the research and the team and everyone who worked really hard to make it. We all had the opportunity to make something that was a portrait of someone who, I went to Martha's Vineyard for the first time for the Black Film Festival there, African American Film Festival, and an older gentleman came up to me and said, I grew up with Rick James in Buffalo since I was 5 years old. And let me tell you, you guys did a phenomenal job. So when I hear stuff like that, it's just like, representing to the best of my abilities, representing who he was to the best of my abilities, and people learning something. And I think there are great things you can learn from his successes and great things that you can learn from his failures.
Love it, man. Sacha, I appreciate you, man. Thank you for taking this time out with us here at Sway's Universe, man.
Listen, I try to be a citizen every day, man. I'm all serious. I hear it. Mahalia Jackson and all that. You know what I'm saying? It's great.
Okay. Oh, man, I appreciate you, man. I thank you very kindly, sir. And then we're going to encourage everybody to watch Bitchin, The Sound and Fury of Rick James, his own Showtime. Job well done, Rich. Let's get that man around.
Yes, man. Thank you for your contribution, man. Your work is very important. Keep doing what you're doing, brother.
Simpson Street, I see you.
You know about that.
Did you see La Madrina, my wife's film about Lorene?
That's my aunt.
I know that. That's why I'm talking to you directly, pointing at you.
Yeah.
Did you see the film?
I've seen the film in pieces. I haven't seen it in one sitting. So I need to see it in one sitting. I only saw it in pieces because they did like a private online thing and I saw a piece of that. And I just saw her, unfortunately, at a funeral about 3 weeks ago. And
right.
We were supposed to get together to really catch up.
Right. That's the OG.
I didn't know that your wife did that film.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's actually more talented than he is, Rich.
She actually is. She's smarter than me, better looking than me, and a great director as well. But this guy, your boy Rich Nice, his hip hop pedigree. If you know who his aunt is, I mean that's where hip hop begins. So
yeah,
he's thorough in these streets.
Yeah, he got other family members that run deep in music too. We might have to do a Rich Nice doc.
Why not?
First rapper on Motown. Why not? Sacha, thank you, brother. Appreciate you.
Yep. Anytime. See you soon.
Okay. Before you hang up,
Yeah.
I want to talk to you too. We started a conversation about me and tech, and I know Peter felt like the job was too expensive or too big, but I still want to tap in with you if you don't mind and see if you could